There seems to be some awareness of climate change, from the data that man is shared, that the awareness is low, and even more importantly, that knowledge about the science behind climate change, I think Prof alluded to that during his presentation, is also is not where it should be. So the whole idea is for a cross-pollination of ideas, of knowledge, so that we can actually take or enhance coordinated action. So a lot of context has been provided from the presentation, earlier presentations today. So I won't waste too much time in setting up context. I mean, just jump straight into the question. But for quick ground rules, I will try to direct the questions to each individual. But after that first response, everyone is also free to chime in or say what they want to say or add to the question. So thanks again for making yourself available. I like to think of it this way. Climate change is not a very attractive topic I find in our area. Not many people want to talk about climate change, but I'm also quite inspired by the fact that a few years ago, Greta Thunberg, I think she's Swedish, a very young climate change advocate. You're looking at her age, as young as 15, was championing reducing or trying to improve the devastating effects of climate change. So if you could get a handle of it, then how much more us who are, I don't think there's any 15-year-old in the room. Okay, so let's start from where we sort of are now. A lot of discussion or reference has been made to floods. I think in Nigeria, in terms of the weather elements, we tend to suffer the most from water, and that tends to result in flooding. In fact, I think annually we experience a lot of flooding. There has been a lot of reference to the 2022 flood, which I think by record was considered the most devastating. I won't dwell so much on the numbers or statistics because that has already been discussed. But I will say, and I think I'll direct this to Dr. Bassi. Let's do a quick post-mortem of what has happened in Maiduguri, the flooding in Maiduguri. There's a lot of reference, I think, from Mr. Patrick about whether it was man-made or purely man-made or due to natural causes. I guess the question too, or a follow-up question or add on to that would be, what could have been done differently to avert the disaster that we experienced? So it's a twofold question. What really happened, not what happened, and what could have been done differently? Okay.
Thank you very much. So it's a misback. If climate change is real, I belong to the school of thought that climate change is real. So people see it as myth. Now, what happens is that name reference to the Alok Dam. So that dam is actually aging, and between 50 years and 100 years, you can have dam, deteriorating badly if care is not taken. And dam is one of those projects listed in for environmental impact assessment. So when you do environmental impact assessment, you must have seen, taking the baseline information, you must have seen the impact that the dam will create after completion. And then you also think of the ways of mitigating its impact. I believe that was done. And now there's also a period called environmental impact audit. You need to audit this project. I believe that dam was not properly audited. And dam has components. So what we see as dam is not actually dam. Dam itself is a barrage that you build to block the water. But you have the reservoir as another component, and you have the intake tower That is like a monitoring mechanism. It tells you when the water is low and when the water is high. And then you can go into evacuation channels to spill the water. And then you don't just spill the water without having a comprehensive drainage network. You should have a drainage design that when you spill the water, where does this water go to? And how about the people in that environment? So that was not properly done. And from the report we had, that vulnerability assessment was carried out not quite long, maybe sometime last month, and money was voted for maintenance. And then the report came out negative as if nothing happened. Two ways. If the dam is aging, you check the seepage. Is it leaking? If it is leaking, and then it means you have to do grouting. You go into concrete arrangement, or you want to do upstream blanket to block it, or you check your spillway, your control mechanism there. So all of that was not done. So climate change came with heavy rainfall. It wasn't a flash flood, it was a river flood that broke it down. And one thing was also missing. If you knew, for them to have gone on vulnerability assessment sometime last month, it means they were aware that there was an integrity question around the dam. So they should have gone into community engagement to think of how the rural people, the vulnerable people, because when hazard strikes and it doesn't mean vulnerability, you can't have disaster. So hazard plus vulnerability will give you disaster. So those people who are living on the floodplain, and the dam, if you check the geography of the dam, is somehow low, it's not high. You can't compare it to Usman Dam, so which is on a high elevation. So now they should have talked to, gone into community engagement with the locals, with the people who were susceptible to the possible disaster, to think of evacuation, how to do with their livelihood, and then not to think of the rush in evacuating. So monitoring the dam, auditing the dam, engaging the people who are susceptible to the possible hazard would have helped to control the situation.
Okay, thank you very much. So as a follow-up to looking at records of the history since 2012, there have been at least no less than 5 floods caused by compromised or overwhelmed dams, some of which include the overwhelming of the Lagdo Dam in 2012, Zungeru Dam in 2018, Kainji Dam in 2020, Lagdo Dam in 2022, and now presently the Alau Dam. Some of these were contributed by natural causes, but often they were also caused by man-made factors such as poor maintenance, like you alluded to, poor construction in some cases, maybe also poor communication and action, like in the draining of the Lagdo Dam. So there are debates to increase, the debates going on in this space. Some are arguing that we should increase flood control dams along some of those water channels or flood channels, whereas others also suggest a relocation or zoning of settlements along floodplains and riverbanks that receive runoff. Which would you argue is a better policy and why? Keeping in mind that for some of these settlements too, they have been able to, over time, eke out a living in those locations. So it may become more and more challenging for them to pick up and leave. This I mean direct to maybe Dr. Chris or Dr. Bassett, anyone.
So, okay, it's a multi-dimensional approach. So you can't do one and leave one. I think the height of this very dam we are talking about, the Alo Dam, is about 10 meters compared to still used to zone as an dam. And then the cubic meters is not that much. So the storage facility for that dam. So the dam somehow has been silted also. You need to go into the silting, deseal the dam and then do the upgrade to increase the storage of the reservoir, so you can upgrade the dam and then to a very good height. And also, what they are saying is true, to relocate people from the floodplain. With due respect to people who are staying at Trademark, I will use this as an example. If I'm the FCT minister, I will chase away all the people on that floodplain and then make it a buffer zone. And then because they are actually sitting on the floodplain, it happens also in Aladimawa. So when you have this, for Abuja, like example, flash flood lasting for up to rainfall lasting for like 6 hours, they will be affected. So it's a multi-dimensional issue. Relocating people from the floodplain, desilting both the dam and the drains, and then do the dam upgrades to increase the capacity of the storage. And don't underuse the dam. Now we need to go into need assessment. What is the demand, the water demand of that domestic dam? You use it for irrigation, use it for domestic use. So what is the demand? So I know in Abuja, sometimes we complain of shortage from the Usuma dam. And then so I don't think that shortage has ever been complained about the Allow dam. So they allow the dam, the water keeps flowing in and then it's being underused. So now making efficient use of the dam can also take away some of this trouble. So it's a multi-dimensional approach. You do all of them, and then if you like, you do concurrently. If you like, you do it face by face, but you can't do it one way. So all of these are important.
Thank you very much. As a bit of an early warning, my next question is going to be on early warning systems and will be directed to Dr. Chris. So every year, agencies like the Nigerian Meteorological Agency publishes the seasonal climate prediction report. Also, you have agencies like the Nigerian Hydrological Agency, which publishes flood watch reports annually. These reports are to help prepare Nigerians and mitigate disasters from occurring. For this year, interesting enough, the SCP report predicted that states like Borno would have an early onset of rains and an above average of rainfall amount, which was a departure from the normal. And I think that in itself was a strong indication that Borno may have been at risk of flooding since they were predicting an above average of rainfall amount. So the question is, how useful and effective do you consider these reports, these early warning system reports, to be to the average Nigerian? Using myself as an example, I think when I got wind of that report, I glanced through it, but I guess I didn't take as much out of it at the time when I initially read it compared to now after I had learned a few things from the news and all of that with the incident. So how useful are these reports, and would you also consider that there's a lag time? Should these agencies keep now these reports, that there may be a catch-up time to which Nigerians may start using or utilizing these reports optimally?
Thank you very much. I think before I answer your question, I'd like to just make reference to some of what has been said earlier, particularly with respect to the Allow Dam disaster, and the larger question as to whether it was a product of negligence or whether it's just climate change. And what I will say to this is that I think just in terms of the broad conversation, because what we want to do is to shape policy and also shape the way people understand issues, we must be very nuanced about the way that we use climate change in conversation, especially given the sociology of our institutions here. If we use climate change in a very unbridled manner, inevitably it will be interpreted as something akin to an act of God about which we will do nothing. So it's very important that when we see disasters, we don't quickly latch onto the idea of climate change. Climate change should not become this umbrella term that explains everything, because it isn't. The Allow Dam was structurally compromised. The communities around sounded an alarm. A state government official did respond and assured those communities that nothing would happen to them. All of that is public record. Does climate change play a role? Yeah, if you have increased rainfall, then that's precisely the point of these early warnings. And we've had increased rainfall over the last few decades. states. I mean, you have them. At this point in our history, increased rainfalls, increased levels of rainfall, or variability in rainfall patterns, they are not strange anymore. They are not alien phenomena. And 30 years ago, this same dam broke, and Maiduguri was also flooded. Precisely 30 years ago, 1994, I believe it was around July. Right? So this has happened before. There's no shortage of case knowledge. So this is not one of the things that I would want us to think of as climate change and therefore throw our hands up in the air and say there's nothing that could have been done. Plenty could have been done, as my fellow panelists have indicated. So to that extent, what we are dealing with, a lot of the issues we're dealing with in Nigeria when it comes to flooding, they are not actually about climate change, they are about infrastructure deficits. They are about the lack of drainage systems. If the dam, you have dams that have been structurally compromised, they are not properly maintained or properly managed, you will have disasters. That is not climate change. There's nothing natural about that. And we must be careful not to conflate natural and man-made disasters, or not to conflate things that are caused by nature and things that are caused by negligence. So that we should be very clear on that. In terms of the reports themselves, I will say that they are absolutely useful. NIMET, the Hydrological Services Agency, and NEMA, they do an excellent job producing these reports. But early warning is simply that, it is early warning. The uptick is left to the clients. And with regard to flooding, for example, if you have an alert from NIMET or from NEMA as well, the emergency management structure in Nigeria is 3 tiers. It's not just federal. So you've got NEMA, but states are meant to have emergency management agencies. That is the place where you have the worst institutional vulnerability when it comes to emergency management. Some states have no SEMAs. Some states have SEMAs that are comprised entirely of one person. Now that's just not serious. So the truth is, when you think of emergency response, like many other things, you must remember that Nigeria is a federation, and you have multiple jurisdictions in Nigeria. Apart from SEMAs, you are also meant to have local emergency management committees that are embedded in local governments. The local governments have been strangled by state governments. So they are functionally non-existent at that level. So all of those gaps affect the response. If NEMA gives an alert, the understanding is that SEMAs, the state emergency management agencies, working with the local emergency management committees, will mobilize resources and do the necessary evacuation from critical areas or vulnerable areas or floodplains or what have you. In practice, many times that does not happen. So NEMA, whose role really is strategic and coordinating at the national level, is now constrained to move into states, multiple states at the same time, when inevitably its resources will be overstretched. So the short answer to your question is that these reports are entirely useful, but their optimal value depends upon the alertness, the alacrity, and the seriousness of the people for whom they are designed. And so if these reports are given to state governments, as you said, even from last year, it was clear which states in Nigeria would suffer flooding. And even in 2022, you had a flood alert. We've had flood alerts have been ongoing for almost 2 decades. So this is nothing new. The response is diffused between federal, state, and local. So if we really want to interrogate why response is so anemic in our country, we should pay attention to what state governments are doing and ask why state governments will not invest the necessary resources in creating state emergency management agencies. So that's my answer to the question.
Very much. So I have a bit of a follow-up question, and maybe I will direct this to Professor Akin Bobola. Because of preparing for this, I've learned a little bit about flash flooding and river flooding, and one happens faster. Flash flooding is water levels from prolonged rain, and with river flooding is more of this is a slower process, it's seeping into the river channel, which is overflow. Now, I'm going to cite something that was referenced, I think, once or twice in the course of today's activities, that according to the UN, Nigeria has the highest rate of deforestation. Another important point was that many would attribute flash flooding as occurring in the north, where the ground is maybe tends to be rocky or doesn't percolate water as quickly as maybe river flooding occurs where the climate tends to be wetter or we have more rainfall. So according to the UN, Nigeria has the highest rate of deforestation in the world, losing 3.7% of its forest every year. So my question is there a nexus between deforestation, where the lack of water absorbing plant cover is no longer there, possibly also due to improved civilization, like we are talking about deforestation to build houses. So is there a nexus between deforestation and increased flooding? Is there a connection, and if so, how worried should we be?
Thank you. Thank you very much. One thing we know is that there is a nexus between deforestation and flooding. When the surface is exposed, it has changed the surface characteristics of that particular environment. Therefore, it's expected that we have increased temperature within that place because the place is already exposed. And after that, the space is also exposed to rainfall. When you look at the intensity used to cause flood, is the intensity of rainfall. The intensity means rainfall per time. Rainfall, we can have it for 30 minutes and we can have flash flood, depending on the surface characteristics, depending on the type of soil that we have. For example, if we have a clay soil, infiltration will be very slow. And again, if you have another type of soil, like a little bit sandy, infiltration must be high. And that is why at times, what used to cause flooding is not expected to cause it if the rainfall is well distributed. Because if, for example, if 800 millimeters of rainfall is repeated, how? What is the distribution? Duration. What is the duration? What if this 800 mm just fall in 2 days? It's going to destroy the environment. But people will still say an average rainfall of 800 mm was received in a particular place. To be useless. Instead of being useful, we need to destroy the environment. So when we expose the soil by cutting all these trees, definitely we are going to have much of the Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. So I hope Dr. Bashir is still there, but before, okay, great. So thank you, sir, for hanging on and being patient. My next question, I think I'll direct to you. Curbing exponential population growth rates is considered a strategy in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, as fewer people will be emitting greenhouse gases. Would you consider this a viable and effective strategy?
Just can you take the question again? I don't think I heard you correctly.
Okay, curbing exponential population growth rates is considered a strategy in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, as there will be fewer people emitting greenhouse gases. Do you consider this a viable and effective strategy?
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you for inviting me once again. And Also to say that you have an amazing panel seated there. I've listened with rapt attention. I didn't even know where the time went to. Thank you all for contributing. So, in answering your question, I believe that yes, curbing exponential growth of the population would be something that would have an impact. Basically, because we've all mentioned human activity as a major driving factor of climate change. Human activity is not something, in fact, because of the exponential growth of the world population, we've had a situation now where we have increased human activity in even locations where we didn't think humans would be able to go to. So a lot of this human activity, increased use of fossil fuels, for instance. If we localize this thing I just said now just to Nigeria, we find that because of increased economic activities in maybe the rural areas, for instance, farmers and all of that, we find that, and also because of the current economic situation, we've not been able to get people to use greener sources of energy. So let's say, for example, cooking. A lot of people in the rural areas can't afford gas, for instance. They would tend to use locally adapted situations to help them to cook. Firewood is something that we find out that people still use a lot, which emits a lot of gas, a lot of those gases in the atmosphere. Another aspect of life where we're still having this increased activity, human activity, because of the interplay it has with people's economic power, is the fact that most people can afford to buy. For instance, I heard someone talk about buying a new car earlier in the discussion. Electric vehicles are still very much unaffordable to a lot of us, despite even being in maybe the higher socioeconomic aspect group of the society. So we find ourselves still using petrol, still using diesel, which because of also a lack of electricity again, we also cannot afford to, so even if we can afford the electric vehicle, we can't, there's no electricity to charge. Now we also have a situation where we tend to want to, because of lack of electricity, we tend to use diesel generators, petrol generators, and then so it's a bit of it's a quagmire that we found ourselves in Nigeria. So on one hand, we're trying to curb population, and then which we know we want to reduce the activity, human activity, but then also the economic reality on ground doesn't permit us to be able to ensure that greener sources of energy that would help us reduce green gases emission in the society is still a problem that we're trying to solve. Over.
Okay, thank you. So I think my next question will go to Professor Grace. So ma'am, in simple terms, can you explain the greenhouse gas effect for the benefit of our audience who may need a refresher course? Just in simple terms, but an allusion to the difference between climate change and global warming. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It means that maybe all the audience here know that are online. They will have to register for Geography 101. Maybe Physics 101 or Methodology 101. Alright. The climate change is the alteration that we see in climate parameters for at least 30 years. But what we see as the variation day to day or seasonal is what we call variability, just a variance. So the rain starts this year in February, and maybe next year it starts in March. That's just variability. And it stops in July, it picks up again in September. It's just all about seasonal variation for a short time. But when we now have it for a period of at least 30 years, in climate science, we normally have that now to be climate change. However, what we are experiencing now is a result of what have taken place years ago. So the flooding in Bono this year is not because of the activities, thank you. It's not because of the activities we just did last year. It's as a result of accumulated human activities over the years. And we can try to have a picture of it this way. We are cutting down trees. We have established that when the vegetation cover is removed, it has implication for the water that will percolate, and it has implication for the runoff. So we have cut down the trees. So the amount of water that's supposed to go down will not go because we have now concretized everything. So the runoff again will not easily go because we have blocked the river channel by some other activities. So water needs to find its way. When it cannot, it will come back, and then the river banks will move up, and that is what we are now having as a repercussion. So we should get it that the effect that we are having today is as a result of the misbehavior, the greediness of human beings that has happened some years back. We have also established in this conversation today that the amount of carbon we have in the atmosphere that we are releasing as human from all our activities, our agricultural practices, the burning of fossil fuel, industrial emission, all these are going back to the atmosphere. But because we have removed the vegetation cover, they're supposed to absorb those things. That's where there is a trouble. In the little integrated sciences, we remember that we breathe out carbon dioxide. What we are breathing out, and all the other ones that are coming from our vehicles, from all other emissions, supposed to be absorbed by the plants, but we have removed the plants. It then means that the carbon has nowhere to go. This carbon, mixing together with other atmospheric gases, especially nitrogen, is where we now have the trouble. So the simple way of explaining it to a layman will be that the trouble we are having is because the amount of the carbon that we are emitted are not necessarily being absorbed by the plant because the vegetation cover are reduced, and also the amount of the carbon that's supposed to be in the ocean are not also the same again. Don't forget that from the one of the videos we saw here today, the aquatic animals are also affected. The amount of heat that is in the ocean now has also increased. So when you combine all this together, you will realize that the nature is perfect. It's just our misbehavior and our misdeeds as humans that has brought us to where we are. So what do we do to reduce all this? Number one is that we should have what I always call environmental stewardship. Even though God has created us to be the super being, when Professor Akibobola was presenting, said God said, give birth to so many children and dominate and have dominion all over this and all that. That is a fantastic responsibility God has given to us. And that responsibility of us controlling, managing, taking care is actually to become stewards of environmental resources. So in stewardship, you are to take care of those resources, having a consciousness that you will still need to tomorrow, generations unborn will still need tomorrow, will need tomorrow, and that's where sustainability will not come into being. The second thing we need to do is what I would call behavioral shift. We will need to press a reset on the way we behave to the environment, the way we pollute, the way we destroy environment. We need to press a reset and behave well. If we don't change, we don't still know another disaster that will come. About 2 weeks ago, I was in Lagos and I saw amazing things in a particular street. It's an open drainage system, but everywhere is blocked. So when it rains, the whole place will be flooded. That's not climate change. It's just because they have done brevies in the channel, in the drainages, and so what will be the result? So we should have behavioral shift. And lastly, climate literacy should continue. And not just conversation we are having here, in our primary school, in our secondary schools, to the market women, the campaign should continue, advocacy should continue, and as we do that, more people will be informed of a better way to live. In my house, we were trying to change to, those of us that are staying in the university quarters, they are kebaje, I don't know the English of kebaje. They are spoiled in a way. So, but we needed to now change to converter and all these things in the house. So the guy that came to install it just said, "Hey, Prof, come. You're using 15 amps, this one." And when he calculated everything, he said, "You are the one consuming most." And all because we wanted prepared, the university will not give us prepared, they just all of us. This is the flat rate. So I wasn't comfortable. I said, "No, let's look for a way out." And in looking for a way out, I discovered that the type of bulbs that we are using were even not economic friendly in terms of energy consumption. And so we press reset, and then we change all the bulbs to the ones that are energy saver. Well, we had 2 watts. I said, "Hey, at least we can still see with it now. No wahala." So these are part of the behavior we will need to change to. And as we do that, gradually, the effort from you and I coming together will be honest and be able to address the impact of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In addition to what for us to clarify what global warming and climate change is. Well, global warming is synonymous to temperature, which is also a driver. Without, there's what we call pressure gradient. If the energy we receive from the sun is safe, there will be wind. Pressure gradient means it is energy that creates the gradient. So wind will blow from a high pressure bed to a low pressure bed. So temperature plays a major role. It's a major aspect of climate change. Let's look at humidity. There are different ways of estimating humidity in the atmosphere. We have mixing ratio, we have a lot, but the major one we stick to is relative humidity. And all these things are varying. There's relationship between relative humidity and temperature. There's relationship between relative humidity and rainfall. That is why at times you see cloud, you'll be expecting rainfall. Rain will not fall. It will be dissipated because the optimum humidity, the optimum temperature is not reached. So if the temperature is unnecessarily high, that rain will not fall. So all these
variables, we call them climatic or meteorological variables, when we aggregate them and there is shift, that is climate change. But when we leave it alone to temperature, we call it global warming. Thank you.
So it showed that 80% of Nigerians nationwide acknowledge an increase in heat or rise in temperature levels. I'm directing this question now to Dr. Bashir. The same survey cited fatigue or tiredness by as many as 30% of the respondents, headaches by 29% of the respondents, rashes by 24%, dehydration by 21%, among others, as common consequences suffered by Nigerians because of the increasing heat wave. I also saw today too that from the findings on climate change survey reports that 63% of Nigerians, as many as 63%, consider annual temperature to have gotten warmer over the past 5 years. So Dr. Bashir, what are some of the health implications of global warming? And do you agree? I would say, do you agree with some of the responses as fatigue, tiredness, headaches, rashes, dehydration?
Atmosphere reduces the amount of carbon dioxide that we get because they take in what we exhale, normally. So when those plants are not there, there's the health effects that come with that. There are heat-related illnesses as a result of rising global temperatures. It will increase the frequency of heat waves that we've experienced in some part of the country. Abuja is a very classic example. A couple of years back, Abuja has not been known to be as hot as it has been in recent times. So heat waves are some of those health effects, which would in turn cause heat exhaustion, heat stroke, dehydration, and some heart-related problems. There's also been noted to be an increase as a result of these emissions. There is increase in respiratory illnesses. It worsens conditions like asthma and sometimes some other chronic obstructive airway diseases. Then there are other gases also that have an indirect effect, which also still cause some of these respiratory problems, like methane is a very common example, and the source of it is some of the agricultural practices, livestock production, from landfills and things like that. Nitrous oxide is also something that is also common as one of the greenhouse gases, and again, the health effects are quite similar to that of carbon dioxide and also methane because of lots of respiratory illnesses. And in terms of productivity, yes. So there's a concept called eco-anxiety, which the United Nations have started talking about quite recently, which is very common with a lot of young people. It stresses the mental effects, the mental health effects that climate change is currently having. People have a lot of post-traumatic stress disorders that happen. For instance, like we've been discussing what has happened and what's currently happening in Maiduguri, for instance. It significantly affects the health of the public, but it increases the prevalence of diseases such as malaria and some waterborne diseases like cholera. Like we've had an outbreak in the last couple of months. So definitely things like this would affect people's productivity. It can affect food production, for instance. So if a farmer, for instance, who has spent the whole of the summer and the early part of the rains cultivating his crops, all of a sudden flood happens and wipes away his entire farm. We also should not forget what it does to people and vulnerable populations like children and the elderly. Once food is affected, it affects people because it can cause also malnutrition, which are all these things that we need to really talk about. So, yeah, the productivity aspect of it, it's more, it's a little bit of, it's very diverse. We can talk about it in several aspects, But more importantly, I would like to even emphasize more about the mental health effects of it, because that is an intangible crisis that people can't feel, you can't touch it, but it affects people. Even just knowing that your relative or your family who live in faraway Maiduguri have issues can even affect you, even though it's not directly, it can affect your work in Abuja, for instance. So it's something that we cannot talk about enough. Of course, to mitigate some of these effects, there must be an investment in strengthening the healthcare system, improving not just the early warning system for the flooding itself, but also improving the early warning signs that we have that would occur from outbreak of diseases during and post flooding, disease surveillance, and also trying to build a climate resilient healthcare infrastructure, particularly in vulnerable areas where some of these climate change effects are very prone. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much. Formerly, before this increasing temperature, when you are traveling to the temperate, they will tell you to buy your malaria drug, because they don't sell malaria drug in the UK, in the temperate, because you don't have mosquito there. Mosquito cannot exist if the temperature is less than 18 degrees. And if the temperature is also more than 40 something or so, they cannot exist. That is why, if you go to Niger, you see some cases. Imagine we carried out a research. Despite the population of people in Kano and in Abure, we discovered that we have more malaria cases reported, because if the humidity is less than 60 degrees and the temperature is around 28, it's a good breeding ground. So we are going to have more of that. So even cerebral spinal meningitis that used to kill people, if the humidity is more than 40, you may not have the cases. And if humidity is less than that, so which is very common in the northern part, over 11 degrees north. So you discover that you have much more cases there than the southern part. So the issue of climate change on health is a very serious issue. Now if you go to Cape Town, southern Nigeria, formerly if you go there too, you won't see all these mosquitoes, but now you begin to see a big one now. That means the environment is gradually, the malaria bed is gradually expanding as a result of climate change. And again, greenhouse gases, they are our enemy, but at the same time, without greenhouse gases, we cannot be on land. This place will be too cold for us. So it is the greenhouse gases that hold on to the heat and keep it within the atmosphere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So my next question has or is related to international relations, and I'll direct it to Dr. Bassi. So I often wonder, since Nigeria is not a major contributor to greenhouse gases or greenhouse gas emissions, why, for example, did we have such a large delegation go to COP28? And maybe more importantly too, how successful and effective have multilateral agreements like the Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement, how have they been in reducing and attempting to reverse the harmful effects of climate change?
These guys came, the big guys, the US, the Russians, and the China. So they were of the opinion that because of our poverty, we were responsible for climate change, and that's because we have done a lot of damage to our forest. Because we are poor, our main source of cooking energy happens to be firewood. So in that case, we have to be involved in climate change financing. So for the global south now kick against the way the developing and underdeveloped countries were like, that shouldn't be the case. That you are the one responsible for climate change because you have been hugely industrialized. So for we are looking for this economic development. Help us to be industrialized first, then we can now talk about the contribution, finance contribution to climate change. So that didn't really see the light of the day. When Kyoto Protocol came and other conferences, now China, for instance, happened to tell the US, because US has been failing to ratify treaties. We saw what happened in Paris agreement where Donald Trump pulled out. And that is why, for me, I feel if Donald Trump, for example, becomes the next president, the outlook of climate change fight will change. Because it calls climate change box, that it doesn't exist. So all the policies that you have made, so if it fails to ratify, as we stand, they produce 51% of the gas, the oil and gas production, much more than the Saudi and Russia. So when you do that, it means you are the greatest emitter of these carbons. So, and yet they are not ratifying. So then came an issue of common but differentiated interest in fighting climate change. They were categorized as Annex 1 countries, and we are not Annex 1 countries. Okay, we have common interest, but differentiated responsibility. Can you contribute more to climate change financing, and then we do less? The whole conversation today, the slogan for the next COP is solidarity and in fighting this. So there hasn't been climate justice if you take these two sides together, the global south and the global north. So for me, I feel that we should now look inward, not believing that we can access this climate finance from the developed countries, because they know what they are doing. The Chinese have not cut down their carbon, though they have announced that okay, they are into clean energy. By next year, there will be a cut down. The US have not done that. The Russians have not done that. So they are fighting among themselves, and then we are getting the heat. Now, why are we affected? Because it's a global environmental issue. So you might be doing this thing outside here, and then it will affect us here. So my own way of looking at it this way is that, okay, we have to think inward. We have to localize our own solution. For instance, I think the NY pool, we have to start the housekeeping with the NY pool. There's a reason I brought this thing here. So if we keep doing like this, if you hold this conference maybe 3 times a year, you know the amount of this thing that will be later on. And this takes about 500 years to decay. And this thing can travel unexpectedly. So now, if you have this and then you put it on a landfill, you have the methane that will also contribute to what we are talking about. And then the soil infertility can also arise from this. So my own opinion is that the hypermarket, the malls that we have around us, can we look for a way of taxing them if they must keep on using nylons to package what we buy from the malls? Can we tax them, kind of environmental tax, except you want to produce things that are biodegradable for packaging? And then there's what is also in vogue now, extended producer responsibility. So a circular economy approach. Those guys who have produced like the bottled water, the Nestle, the Aquafina, the LA, they should be involved in the cycle of production and consumption. So let them go, and even if it means making additions to it, we don't want to see Nestle water empty water. So we encourage reuse of this bottle, because if you want to go into recycling also it requires heavy heating. So you are also emitting in the course of recycling. Maybe you reduce 40 to 50% in doing so. So if there is that extended producer responsibility, and then we tax people who are responsible for packaging what we buy within, I think we will begin to think inward rather than relying on climate change financing from the world powers. So that's my position. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, please.
Thank you. So there is a concept in international relations that is colloquially described as kicking away the ladder of development. And what it means is that when the first world countries ascend the ladder of development, specifically through industrialization, they now turn around and say that global south countries should not use that same ladder, and then they use climate change as a pretext for essentially proposing policies that would keep African populations or global south populations in intergenerational poverty. Because for us, from our point of view, both as Nigeria and as Africa, you cannot lift our population out of poverty without industrialization. It is industry that creates jobs. Those jobs will be on a scale that can absorb the numbers of young people that we have. So we need industry. But the apparent, if you want to be harsh, fraudulence of the global conversation around climate change is that African countries account for a very negligible percentage of the emissions. The countries of the global north, who in the course of their industrialization created the problem, now turn around and say, well, you can't use this same approach because it will spoil the environment. And well, of course, our own response to that is, but when you were doing it, you didn't realize it was spoiling the environment. We need to industrialize, and we need to get ourselves or lift people, our own people, out of poverty. So that's why the federal government's core approach in the last 4 or 5 years has been centered around the National Energy Transition Plan, specifically just energy transition, which is what we call it. So the simple argument of just energy transition is this, that you cannot say to poor African countries to simply transit to renewables, that that's not useful, because we cannot afford it. And because of our population, we cannot afford it at scale. So for us, our strategy is to say, look, we have abundant reserves of natural gas. We can use natural gas as our transition fuel, because our goal is that by 2060 we will achieve net zero status. So, but rather than jumping from where we are now, crude oil, to renewables, why don't we invest in gas, harness our natural gas reserves, use that to power industrialization and all of that. And then, when we've gotten to that level, that point of readiness, then we can now begin to do renewables. Now, that's the path that China took. The reason why China can produce, I think at this moment, China is probably the world's largest producer of solar power. It's because it built industrial capacity. So if you want to lift people out of poverty, then you have to industrialize. And the reason why this is important is because a lot of the things we are identifying as either drivers or consequences or accelerants of climate change are actually symptomatic of poverty. Energy poverty is the reason why people cut trees. Predominantly, tree cutting, firewood, is not even about commercial anything, it's about domestic subsistence. It's why more women and girls are exposed to smoke inhalation, because they are the ones that cook, right? So if you're talking of lifting people out of poverty, in fact, the number one climate change strategy is actually to industrialize and lift your people out of poverty. That's what it is. Then you find that you build the industrial capacity to do certain things. China is also either the first or the second largest producer now of EV, electric vehicles. Again, you cannot do that if you have not prior built industrial capacity. So these are the ways in which, for us, in the context of international relations, the context of the global conversations around the power politics and the geopolitics of this is the way that Africans, that Nigerians, as far as our own policy of just transition is concerned, it is the way we are thinking, that we cannot sacrifice our industrial aspirations on the altars of climate change, a catastrophe that you did not cause, that even at this moment, you are still not the one causing, proportionally speaking. You are still not the one causing it, right? So I think that it's important that we also take that, so that we don't find ourselves
condemning ourselves to impoverishment on an intergenerational scale, and we think that we are doing it because we are trying to comply with something, some standard that has been set for us elsewhere. We must frame our terms of engagement with the world, not the other way around. Thank you.
Very strong points made there. About a year or so ago, I was involved in a farmer headers project where I worked in Delta State. So I'm trying to set up some context here. The main reason, as often cited for farmer headers conflict, is scarce resources in the north that makes the headers go to the south for greener pastures. Now, back then, there were intervention projects that helped set up mediation committees. I'm directing this question now to Dr. Chris, who was the last speaker. That helped set up mediation committees between the headers, who were like the visitors, and farmers, who were the locals. And it helped make sure that the conflicts, many of those conflicts, did not degenerate into a crisis. But shortly after funding for some of those programs, and this happened in Delta State, Taraba, Benue, and Nasarawa State, at least some of these programs that I'm aware of. Shortly after funding for those projects dried up, there was no sustainability in an effort that was considered to be doing some good. So I guess the question is, what can be done to ensure sustainability for some of these good endeavors? The mediation committees that existed then also served in some way as an early warning system, because by the time conflict is brewing, it comes up at those meetings before it escalates into or degenerates into something else. So in your view, with your experience in early warning systems, what can be done to sustain some of these endeavors, useful endeavors?
So it's important to, when we talk about farmer-herder conflicts are one of those concepts that again have been stretched and they become an umbrella term. So not everything that happens is a farmer-herder conflict. I mean, in the true sense of the term conflict. Some of the things we are dealing with are just crime, criminality. Some of it is terrorism, some of it is banditry. We have to be able to disaggregate. The second thing is that funded programs of the sort that you're referring to are not really, how shall I put this? They are good in the short term, but they are like a band-aid, right? They are not a permanent solution. The reason why NGOs step in is because governance at the local level has collapsed. Previously, and when I say previously, I mean 4 decades ago, 5 decades ago, and beyond, the conflicts between farmers and herders were mediated by the traditional rulers in many places. So in northern Nigeria, for example, the traditional rulers had powers of taxation over cattle. So there were cattle taxes that were administered by traditional rulers. Those powers were subsequently taken away from the traditional rulers. Now, what taxation did, the power of tax, what it does is that it gives you, as the traditional ruler, the incentive to monitor how many herders and how many herd of cattle have come into your domain, because that's the only way you can tax them. So you can't have efficient taxation without efficient administration. They go together. But when that power was taken away from the traditional rulers now hand-stuffed the administration because there was no incentive to do it. And the herders themselves became alienated completely, where before they were recipients or clients of extension services, technical support, veterinary support, ways in which local governments and traditional institutions were helping them even tend their cattle better. All of that disappeared. Now, In theory, what should have happened was that if that power was taken away from traditional rulers, it should have passed to local governments. But instead of passing to local governments, it was left in limbo, and the local governments themselves have collapsed, right? Strangulated by state governments. So what happens is that you have a vacuum, and in that vacuum, that is where farmers and herders exist. If you go to a rural community, you don't see any evidence of government in rural communities. There's no presence of government, and to be sure, it is not the presence of the federal government I'm talking about, it's the presence of local government. Because in the Land Use Act, non-urban lands are actually the preserve of local governments. If you look at the Local Government Acts, or even rather the Constitution, you'll be amazed at the number of things that are within the jurisdiction of local governments. We often think that it's either the federal or the state. But something like primary health care, basic education, garbage disposal, a lot of things that actually have impacts on our environment are actually in the purview of local governments. So to come to your question as to why those programs don't last, they cannot last because by design they are not sustainable. They cannot be a substitute for what governance should do. So rather than saying if you have a 3-year program or an 18-month program, right? If the 18-month program expires or lapses, the funder pulls out the funds and moves elsewhere. You can't run a country like that. That's just a short-term measure. This is ultimately an issue of governance. And by governance, I mean specifically the restoration of local governance. Which is why I'm quite happy about this, moves towards local government autonomy, because I think that if we build capacity at that level, we'll be able to deal with a lot of these issues. Some of them are law enforcement, some of them are security. The reason why they degenerate into conflict is because both communities have lost faith in government. So they have to take the laws into their own hands. On one side, either to protect their cattle, or on the other hand, to attack those that trespass on their farms, and all of that. But the last thing I will say is, just generally speaking, in broad terms, because this has to do with development, I think that a fundamental problem is that too many people, too much of our population lives off of the land in Nigeria. And what I mean is this. We say agriculture is the largest employer, the biggest employer. Now, in the US, for example, it is about 4%, between 3 and 4% of the population that are engaged in agriculture. They outproduce Africa, right? So, the volume of agricultural productivity actually has nothing to do with how many people are involved in it. What you see is the product of the extent to which agricultural processes have been industrialized. If they are industrialized, then productivity can be amplified by several orders of magnitude. So when you look at the top, the most advanced economies, you will find that most of them, the quantum of their population doing agriculture, that depend on land for their subsistence, or rather economic activity, is less than 10%. Less than, right? But in Nigeria, you come to Nigeria, you start hearing that 40% of the people, 50%, very outrageous figures. And we keep saying things like, everybody go back to the farm. If everybody goes back to the farm, you will have conflicts. Because remember, the quantum of arable land available is also shrinking. I hope you understand what I mean. So now what it means is that your population is rising. Because you have not industrialized to create opportunities that can take in those people, you're saying to them, go back to the farm. More people are going back. They are competing over a resource that is getting scarce. And in each generation, it's getting more and more scarce. So you will have conflict. So just broadly speaking, an aim for our government, or as a people we should have, is that if we want to lift people out of poverty, it will not involve telling everybody to go and farm. That is not how it works. You need to look more at investing at agro-industrial expansion, being able to raise the productivity levels of our farmers. And in any case, you know that much of our country, they are made up of smallholder farmers, right? Smallholder farmers plus rain-fed agriculture. You cannot get food security with that. Rain-fed agriculture will not give you food security. On a basic level, it's why sometimes you have fruit, sometimes you don't have them. Even the price inflation of tomatoes is related to the fact that it is seasonal. And now you have more mouths that want that. And the tomato belt is in places that are insecure. So we have to combine all of these things, but I think the summary of the situation for me is that beyond the talk of governance, strengthening local governance, we must recognize that if you have a high population of smallholder farmers who are dependent on rain-fed agriculture, you're not going to produce much to start with, right? Comparatively speaking, you're not going to be able to produce much. So we need to now begin to think of how do we amplify productivity? How do we really scale up? And that's why I keep referring to agro-industrial expansion. That's what I meant to say. Thank you.
Excuse me, just to add to it, not just only in agriculture, nearly all sectors of our lives as Nigerians, that we don't go beyond experimentation. The kind of initiatives you have referred to are like experimentation, and we fail to sustain it because the resources and capacity to sustain it are not actually on ground. I'm involved in a kind of assessment on this energy transition that you are talking about. And when we finished the assessment, we discovered that none of the projects submitted from Nigerian universities could meet up. So one of the journalists that were there during the press conference said that with over 200 universities in Nigeria, you mean no project from Nigeria could meet up with the criteria that all these judges have assessed. But the issue is that we aren't looking for projects that are within the laboratory. We are looking at the scalability and the impacts on the general populace. So, the kind of initiatives you have referred to are just laboratory experiments. But we couldn't scale up because the capacity to do that are not in place. And one of the capacity issues is the issue of governance. Go around, you see a lot of mini water schemes. But you will get international award that, oh, you have provided this water for this community. But beyond that community of 5,000 population, can we scale that up? Those are the challenges we have. So, until we wake up as a country to see it that infrastructural development, industrialization is not a joke, it's something we will have to have a plan for as a nation that will walk through it. It doesn't matter the regime, it doesn't matter the party that is in government, but that we have a national plan that we are following through. Not just that I will start something and tomorrow when I'm no more in government, that will be abandoned and something else will crop up. We cannot continue like that and think we will develop as a country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So this is just another reminder to our virtual attendees that they can send their questions in and we'll be taken up in the poll session. I'll continue asking some questions, hoping that I will get feedback from the virtual attendees so that they are also part of this engagement process. So, ma'am, during your presentation, you had talked about vulnerable groups. How can Nigeria ensure that climate adaptation strategies are inclusive and protect vulnerable groups such as women, youth, and internally displaced persons who are disproportionately affected by climate change?
Thank you very much. In my presentation, I made mention of the co-production of knowledge. It means that from the beginning of identifying the problem, they should be part of the conversation. A project was done by Waterheads. Waterhead is a UK-based NGO, and they got to that particular community. They discovered they do not have water, so they just give them this hand pump water services, and then they cut tape. Normally you will cut tape, they will clap, and after a year, they went back there for monitoring to be sure whether the project is being used. It was discovered that the community weren't using the project, so they made an inquiry. And the people said, yes, we needed water, but you did not ask us where we want the location to be. That each time our children will go and look for water, that is the opportunity for husband and wife to have conjugal bliss. Now you put the water in front of the compound. Husband and wives could not do conjugal bliss again. And that's why we lock up the water project and we say, children, continue to trek to go and do that. And also for the children, they said each time they go outside to go and fetch water, it's an opportunity to play. Do you see that? So, when they were doing the project, they were planning for them, not with them. So, it means that from the assessment of even the risk, this vulnerable should be part of the conversation. And it is then that you'll be able to know that, oh, this is what they want, this is how they want it to be done. But if we just close our eyes and you drop anything for them, no matter spend money and energy, but it may not really be effective at the end of the day. Thank you.
Okay, so to add to that, she has touched a very important part, which is community engagement, and that's where advocacy comes in. So when you are, when I also saw the NY poll or the survey, so I also encourage the organization to go deep and also have targeted respondents, then look at the vulnerable and also see what they experience differently. So when you do the need assessment, the vulnerability assessment, and then incorporate the vulnerables, so you will be well informed in taking your decision. Now there's a tool now developed by the United Nations Habitat. It is called CityRap, Resident Action Plan. So what that tool does is to engage the vulnerable populations and then get information about the local environment, because it is their environment they should know better than they are, then you involve them in the planning. So when you look at the CityRap, some of them also do the design for themselves. It's just like a client that seeks for the professional touch of an architect. So an architect does not actually design the plan for us, but what he does is the embellishment, putting the finesse. But you are the one to tell the architect that I need 3-bedroom flat, 4-bedroom flat, so we will know what to do to achieve ventilation or cross ventilation, if you like, and the lighting. So in the case of the vulnerable population, they are best informed in telling you what they need and what they have been experiencing. So that CityRap is also a very fine tool to get the community involved. Thank you.
We'll just take concluding remarks, hopefully not more than 60 seconds. I don't know who would like to go first. Okay.
Well, now we know that climate change is real. Therefore, we are supposed to engage ourselves in things that will not enhance, climate change. And all the discussion we have had here, I want us to go back and implement them. It is very, very important. Thank you very much.
So it has also been established that deforestation is the high-ranking factor or driver for the climate change for us here. Looking at the two pressing forests in the world, that is the Amazon basin and the Congo basin, they are well protected to an extent. So just like one of the speakers said, so if we can get our forest protected, and then to also, the town planners too should also be encouraged to take a paradigm shift when it comes to plan approval. We can now begin to check how many number of trees you need to plant alongside your building. If it is a 500 square meters plus, can you give us 4 to 5 trees? If it is a 1,000 square meter, can you give us 10? Depending on the uses, whether it is commercial, or residential, or industrial. So that can also help us for the trees to save more carbon. Thank you very much.
My conclusion remarks would be that we should act right. Whatever we do, and in our dealings with the environment and our fellow human beings, act right. That is justice. That is fairness. Thank you.
I think one of my final remark would be that it's important to be very intentional about how we frame the conversation around climate change in our own country. Because climate change has both a generic meaning, but it also has specific meanings in different places. And you must locate it within our own experience, within our own history, within our own trajectory as a country where we are. We are 64 years old. There are countries that are 300 years old, 700 years old, industrialized beyond our reach. We are not in the same class. We are not having the same conversation. So we must think of ourselves in terms of our own needs. Netherlands is a country almost entirely below sea level. It has engineered its environment to work for it. And I stress this because every time a dam is structurally compromised, or you have a flooding incident that is manifestly because we've not built drainage systems, even in places below sea level in our country, we start talking about climate change. I find those references unknowingly diversionary. And you will not get performance from the authorities if you don't frame the conversation rightly. Because you can't blame anybody for climate change. I mean, you can blame God, but you can't do anything about that. But when you say this is about engineering, it's about infrastructure, it's about holding people accountable for maintaining critical infrastructure, that changes things considerably. The second thing is that we must recognize the multidimensionality of climate change. So Dr. Bashir, I think he talked about the population and what you can do in terms of population reduction. We can't achieve population reduction, by going for population reduction. To bring down population reduction, you have to improve child mortality indices. The reason why many people have many children is because they are trying to hedge against child mortality. I will have 10 children because I'm convinced that 5 of them will die. So it's even in our local languages. It's why we have a name like Kashimawo. That's what it means. Let us wait and see if he will live. So you must understand, and there's a variant of it in Igbo as well. So what I'm trying to say is that this is a conversation about development. It's not about clouds and sunlight. Those are just props. It's about our development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been an enlightening and enriching session. I know I've also taken a lot of time.